Right, we should get started. My name is Michael Lachney. I'm going to be chairing this panel. The panel is called Ethics of Connections. Networks aren't neutral. They perform an implicit function in how and where they link their members and serve as ethical actors in their own right. We will begin with Joshua McWhirter, a researcher, audio producer, and MA candidate in Theories of Urban Practice at the Parsons School of Design here in New York City. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all. I'm very grateful to be here and to participate in the panel. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about my research, which focuses on locative media, more specifically location-based mixed reality mobile digital media, much like the kind recently popularized by Pokemon Go. Though my interest in this topic is rooted in another locative game called Ingress, which is Pokemon Go's predecessor upon which many of its main gameplay functions and are modeled after. So I'll discuss Ingress intermittently throughout the presentation, though I won't go too deeply into its complex plot or gameplay, and I'm happy to talk to anybody after the presentation about my fieldwork with Ingress in particular. So mixed reality locative media is not as new as one would suspect, and not only have I tried to historicize the medium's various iterations in gaming, art, and annotative or narrative platforms over the past 20 years, but I've also connected these media to critical urban issues and investigated their infrastructural and ideological dimensions, problematizing both the global positioning system and its military-industrial entanglements, and the kinds of networked spatial logics and normative urban imaginaries that are deployed and reinforced through these interfacial media. So my research is also driven by questions that are provoked by the hybrid spaces created through locative intermingling of real and virtual. What new issues arise when the politics of the digital meet the politics of the street, and what new forms of sociality emerge within this milieu. However, before I dive into all of that, I kind of want to fall back on some very classic theory and talk a little bit about Walter Benjamin's Arcades project. So in this famous unfinished work of historical materialism, Benjamin used a unique methodology which sought to collapse past into present through a recognition that, quote, image is dialectics at a standstill. He operationalized this idea through a technique called literary montage, a collage-like assembling of different texts into, quote, large-scale constructions out of the smallest and most precisely cut components to discover in the analysis of the small individual moment the crystal of the total event. So Benjamin's objects of analysis were what he considered to be dialectical images, these material artifacts whose embedded social relations he would unpack as a means of examining the social origins of his own time, in particular the interwar European culture, through the material culture of an earlier time, 19th century Paris. So in my research, I've been trying to sort of treat locative media and mixed reality gaming, such as Ingress, as both a form of transmediated literary montage and as a dialectical image, or perhaps more appropriately, a cyborg image, after Donna Haraway, whose cyborg metaphor extends, and I think, in my opinion, deepens that kind of sense of a Marxist dialectic, suffusing it with a deeper understanding of techno-social mediation, an understanding that I'm here applying to the interfacial mediation of human experience in urban environments. So, on one hand, locative media functions as montage in layering the space of the screen onto real urban space, setting up this tension between virtual and real spaces and networks. On the other hand, the media are themselves as an object of inquiry, a dialectical, or as I said, cyborgian. I would argue that the relations embedded within locative mixed reality media can, like the Parisian arcades did for Benjamin, illuminate some of the social origins of our own precarious, fragmented, and hyper-real moment. As I mentioned, pulling at these relational threads has led me from interface to infrastructure and representation, to looking at how the surveilling logics of the global positioning system and its military origins intersect at times in startlingly direct ways with the neo-Cartesian panoptic, objective, and thus implicitly hegemonic epistemologies of digital mapping tools such as Google Maps and Google Earth. And I'd like to describe just quickly an anecdote which illustrates this kind of startlingly direct connection between an institution of warfare, for example, and locative media. So as geolocation technologies began proliferating through Western consumer markets in the late 1990s, a tech-savvy entrepreneur named John Hankey created a startup company called Keyhole Inc., which was funded largely by a CIA-run venture capital firm named In-Q-Tel. And at Keyhole Inc. sought to develop new 3D digital cartographic applications based in part on the precise location data available through GPS. Keyhole's Earth Viewer application, in addition to finding early users in the military and intelligence communities, also became a popular visualization tool for news agencies at the start of the US invasion of Iraq, bolstering the company's popularity and market share. So Keyhole was purchased by Google in 2004, and its Earth Viewer application was rebranded and re-released as Google Maps and then later Google Earth. Years later, the founder of Keyhole Inc., John Henke, still under the umbrella of Google, would later found and incubate a game company called Niantic Inc., which is the developer of both Pokemon Go and Ingress. So this relational analysis of locative mixed reality media has also forced me to consider it as one element in an assemblage of computational technologies, interfacial and geolocative, but also addressive in other ways, like the networked objects comprising the Internet of Things, that produces its own kind of theoretical hybrid space, where the virtual space of the Internet and the space of the city feed back into one another. So locative mixed reality media then can be seen as a tool for conceptually exploring and even mapping hybrid space, the space of the mediation itself. And through its various iterations in art, storytelling platforms, or massively multiplayer games, even as a means of probing the social and political dispositions of urban space. So in effect, these kinds of applications are, even in their most seemingly innocuous forms, are sort of psychogeographies of hybrid space. And for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with this term psychogeography, it comes from the Situationists International, and Guy Debord of that group defined it as, quote, the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So I've discovered throughout my research this kind of specific reference to a radical group like the Situationists International, and indeed to other members of a largely white male European canon of critical theory like Walter Benjamin and Henri Lefebvre and Deleuze and Guattari. This connection is not necessarily an original insight on my part. So locative media art practitioners, for example, have for many years now considered the ways in which such projects are capable of exploring complex, radical ideas of space and inhabitation and migration in ways that, in my opinion, both hold a lot of promise but are not entirely without their problems. So one early example would be Urban Tapestries by art collective Proboscis, which was a pre-smartphone platform for annotating urban places with stories of everyday life in a London neighborhood. Another example would be John Craig Freeman's Border Memorial, a mixed reality meditation on migrants who have died attempting to cross the border between Mexico and Arizona. Locative media projects have also taken less visual forms as well, as in Brian Greenspan's locative storytelling project StoryTrek, a spatial novel platform theorized by its creator as a form of utopian storytelling. Or artist Terry Reed's locative audio-only sidewalks, which explore contested meanings of ecology and cultural heritage. So it also may go without saying that the survey of projects begs us also to think about who's designing these types of media and for whom, and to consider the rich possibilities of using such media for operationalizing theories of space and habitation and migration that go beyond the kind of typical references to the largely white male European body of critical theory. So on that note, it's also crucial to consider the emerging social geographies within hybrid space, and how mixed reality locative media, particularly games like Pokemon Go and Ingress, are already becoming platforms beyond the cities of the global north. So Ingress has several million active players around the world. The game is even quite popular in China, where because of the firewalling of Google services upon which Ingress relies, many players must either jailbreak their phones or establish VPNs to play. So it would be short-sighted to consider ignoring the global intersectional dimensions of how people will use and already use locative mixed reality media in the future. So there are already at least 2.6 billion active smartphone subscriptions in the world by 2020 that are projected to be 6 billion, and that doesn't even account for the ways in which such media are increasingly migrating across interfaces to wearables like Apple's Watch or Microsoft's HoloLens. So the geography of hybrid space may be uneven, but it is truly global, increasingly accessible and immersive, and generating new ways of being public. So locative mixed reality media at the moment seem like useless diversions, but I would argue that they are in fact working upon us, the users, situated within different identities. They're working upon us, conditioning perceptions of space and acting as a kind of praxis for different social and spatial protocols. So more thoughtful iterations of media have made attempts at a kind of seamful design, where the affordances of different users situated within different identities are foregrounded, or even as a kind of disruption of normative spatial experiences highlighting social and political issues. But in their most mainstream forms, Mixed reality reinforce highly normative urban values. They decontextualize places and foster techno-optimistic imaginaries which are either amenable to or simply blind to the spatial protocols of overlapping systems of control, particularly how these systems such as capitalism, racism, and colonialism have forcibly displaced people in the name of progress or development. So speculatively, I'd like to think about where exactly all this is going. There have already been many documented cases of people using Pokemon Go, for instance, as a platform for anything from finding sexual partners to robbing people, and even forms of social commentary. And so much has already been written about how social media, despite its proprietary status and cooperation with the state, has served as a platform for organizing major political activities, such as the ones which, as I found it today, evidently inspired conferences like Theorizing the Web. Thanks. So in the contemporary moment we find ourselves, is it so far-fetched to see how these mixed reality media could be used to mobilize political action? Right? So going back to Benjamin's montage method may be helpful for thinking about one potential tactic within this realm. Locative media might be directed toward making the visible and invisible visible, of bringing to light things that are meant to be forgotten within the neoliberal city. Perhaps locative mixed reality can be more effectively rescripted into something like an immersive, place-based, interfacial performance. Assemblages of people, artifacts, stories, and spaces that can be activated and expanded upon as sites of collective memory retrieval, for radical speculation, of building and sustaining a hybrid commons, and as a means of developing or playing out liberating practices in space and time situated in human bodies. And these assemblages need not rely on ambivalent imperial infrastructures necessarily like GPS. Artist Philip Rondenberg, for instance, has been developing an open positioning system, a pirate positioning system which relies not on satellites, but on locally distributed DIY seismic vibration sensors. So I want to end by provoking the possibility that locative mixed reality media and their proprietary interfaces can be either hacked or reappropriated towards something resembling parody, critique, and subversion of the proprietary city. In any case, we can perhaps embrace them as dispositioning systems, as a means of understanding and operationalizing theory through the interfaces and networks of transmediated landscapes that we already have and the ones to come. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So we'll save questions for the end, so make sure to write them down so you don't forget them if need be. Next, we have Benjamin Haber. He's a PhD candidate in sociology at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and a, how do you say it again? Macaulay Institute Instructional Technology Fellow at Brooklyn College. He has published widely on queer theory and digital media, and recently organized a 2-day conference, Queer Circuits in Archival Times, Experimentation and Critique of Networked Data. Welcome, Benjamin.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm a little worried about this presentation because it's part of a much larger piece of work where I'm sort of doing a lot of different things around sort of interrogating what I'm describing as resonances between queer ideas about sociality and queer epistemologies and the ways that digital sociality is sort of modifying social life. And just to note, I'm going to be talking about Snapchat a lot in this presentation, and mostly when I'm talking about Snapchat, I'm talking about this part of Snapchat which is now fairly marginal, right, where you like send a picture or video to another person, it disappears, you know, they have all these new products, and I'm not really going to mention much about those because I feel like the part that I'm talking about is the most interesting, so just to know. All right, so I'm going to start with talking about queer temporality. There we go. There's a lot of literature that I could have used to talk about this. Queer time, queer temporality is pretty vast literature. But I picked these two because I feel like they sort of reflect some of the things that I am talking about when I'm talking about sort of a queer resonance with the forms of sociality that are inspired, or that digital capitalism are sort of producing. I have this quote from Jose Munoz that talks about how the politics of the ephemeral is the opposite of visibility politics. It produces this legacy of traces, glimmers, residues, and specks of things. And I like this quote because it sort of frames this like queer response to a sort of visibility politics that has been a large part of like mainstream LGBT activism, and it sort of, reflects the way that ephemeral media or ephemeral sort of like performance or the ephemeral in general is not, it doesn't just disappear after it disappears, right? It sort of lives on in these queer ways, right? And I also have this quote about the stretched out adolescences of queer culture. And that's another thing that I'm really interested in terms of Snapchat, because Snapchat, unlike a lot of the different sort of platforms, major social media platforms, doesn't really like seemingly to me have a lot to offer like adults or people who work, right? And so this idea that, one of the ways that like queer temporality works is that it sort of is a reconfiguration of the, normative life cycle, right? That the vision of like youthful exuberance, then you get married and go into adulthood and get a job, like that. In some ways, Snapchat I think kind of benefits from a reconfiguration of how we understand life cycles and this sort of like idea of a stretched out adolescence, or at least like I think that they hope that there is a sort of stretched out adolescence that they can continue to profit from. All right, so there's a lot of conversation in the world right now about privacy, of course, and mostly I would say, especially in academia, this is talking about privacy as it relates to the state or from capital, right? A sort of withholding or, worry about people giving too much away to powerful institutions. But the thing that I'm going to talk about in queering the public and the private is an idea of privacy that's more interactional, that you can kind of see in maybe this quote from McWhirter, where he talks about how privacy and the bounds of privacy and the sort of way that we define the private and the public and negotiate between these things are not just like about, what happens to your information or, whether or not you can protect yourself from the state, but it's also about elaborating new worlds of culture, and particularly in terms of gender and sexuality. There's a long history of sort of queer work that complicates distinctions between public and private that I won't get into, but that, I think that one of the ways that queer theory can sort of add to a conversation around privacy and digital media more broadly is to sort of think about this, complication here, the idea that, the ways that privacy and publicity gets talked about on the internet can also be sort of like complicated and doesn't have to be so, binary. And so part of this to me is that like I'm interested not just, in moving away from a binary, I'm interested in moving away from a sort of insistent discussion about the loss of privacy and the ways that people are, sort of like unwilling dupes and, or uninterested, right? There's a lot of talk about how we can educate people or educate youth or do something to like make people understand that, their privacy is being lost. But, and I say this not to like, make light of that work. I truly do think it's really important. But I also think that sometimes when you just talk about privacy in the context of loss, you sort of lose out on the ways that you know, giving up privacy is an important part of what we do as public people. And, you know, one of the things that is troubling about just thinking about privacy in terms of loss or lack or removal is that there is this thing that I'll talk about in a second that, you know, when you frame privacy around loss, oh my God, you provide an opening for different kinds of profitable forms of securitization, right? And so I have this Wendy Chung article or quote right here where she talks about the epistemology of outing that depends on the illusion of privacy, which it must transgress. And I think that that's kind of, you know, gets at this, you know, idea that I'm going to keep talking about, that there's something about the way that the discourse of privacy, I think, leads us to a desire for a sort of like fidelity to companies that can help us, you know, be more, you know, retrenched in, you know, not so scared of the ways that our privacy is being lost. And I think that's dangerous. All right, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but, you know, I'm going to go through pretty quickly these little minor objects of everyday digital life, shading, subtext, and shadow, that I feel like are sort of important and not talked about enough in terms of like framing our experience of using these devices that we use all the time. This is a screenshot from a Snapchat story, which I see a lot of stuff like this on Snapchat, right? Like there's a lot of you know, media that sort of talks about the way that the youth are sort of moving beyond labels and stuff, and so I thought it would be nice to pair that with this Jasbir Puar quote, where we could sort of start thinking about, you know, the differences between gay and straight, or like what those categories mean, through what she calls the quotidian and banal activities of sexual self-elaboration. And that's kind of a little bit what I'm going to be doing. So I am interested in some, you know, pretty minor aspects of Snapchat, but I think they're important. This screenshot notification is what I'm talking about, the pink thing there and the green one on the bottom. You know, Snapchat often gets talked about in terms of privacy or desire for privacy or desire for, you know, having a sort of lower stakes form of communication, but, you know, they've actually made it a lot easier to, you know, save images and to take screenshots and whatever. And what's interesting to me about that is that it seems to suggest a sort of gamification almost of privacy, or like turning privacy into a sort of negotiation or a kind of play, right? Where you know, interact with people and maybe progressively send racier and racier pictures, and if they don't screenshot your media, maybe you'll like start to trust them. So there's an interesting way that this like little symbol, I think, has allowed the sort of negotiation between people on Snapchat to be a little bit more playful. And my favorite thing about Snapchat that apparently everybody else I know hates is this aspect of Snapchat where when you get a snap, you have no idea whether or not it was sent to just you or if it was sent to like 20 different people, right? I mean, you of course can use context and stuff to understand that, but, you know, it's a fascinating, you know, for me, that speaks to the way that like this strategy that was clearly a way for Snapchat to sort of increase metrics, right? To increase the amount of snaps that are sent, sort of almost encourages a sort of like promiscuous kind of sociality, right? That you might, instead of just sending that naked picture to your partner, you might send it to a couple other people and see who, you know, see what happens. And so, oh wow, I'm gonna run out of time. So in contrast to that, I am thinking about Apple, right, as being the sort of securitization, the retrenchment, the ways that the scary open internet sort of like provides a, you know, form of comfort, right? And I'm not going to get into this too much, but I do a similar kind of analysis here of the read receipt as a sort of way of, keeping you at a sort of state of alertness. I don't know how many people actually, keep those turned on. I don't really know very many people who do, but it is, it's only my mother really, actually. But, there's something like really, intense about it that we can talk about later. And then this Find My Friends thing, which I feel like really is evoked by the image itself, where you have like two people literally attached to each other, which is their app where you can share your location with people indefinitely, right? And here's other things that I'll just talk about later. But, the I guess final word here for me is that there are, different kinds of ways that risk can be managed in the internet age, and I'm trying to sort of think about ways in which we can imagine infrastructures where risk-taking is part of the pleasure of using digital technologies instead of this sort of way of, making people feel like they need to sort of move into these centralized, protective, bubbles, like Apple. I'll stop there.
Outstanding. So next we have Caitlin Turner. She is a PhD candidate at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Her research combines prior experience in conflict analysis and resolution with research in communications on mesh networks, infrastructure, and the history of alternative media. Her current project focuses on the intersections of media infrastructure and social change. She also does not really like cats.
That's an understatement. I hate them.
So welcome.
I was like, now my nerves are going because you said cat. All right. How is everybody? Like you all, I got many a very personal email, but also very alarming email about 12 minutes for presentations. And because I'm used to cramming 20, 30 minutes into 15 minutes, 12 is just like, I'm done. I can't do this. So I've decided to do something a bit different for myself today. And instead of presenting sort of on a formal research project that I've conducted, I want to talk today about the foundations of my research, the things that drive it, that get me up in the morning and nerding out all day by myself. And I'm hoping that this can sort of spark conversation either in Q&A or after. And on that vein, I also want to start with a bit of a story about a first-year undergraduate Intro to Communications course. My favorite lecture in that class is always on the internet. And I love it because when you're talking about the internet to kids born in the late 90s, let that sink in a second, they think they know everything about the internet. And there's absolutely nothing that I, the pre-internet, totally historic human being at the front of the room, can tell them that they don't already know. Challenge accepted, right? Like, come on, little people, I got you here. So the first thing I asked them to do is to think about the internet and draw it for me. Grab a piece of paper, just draw me a picture. A couple minutes go by, I collect those up, and I'm going to give you a smattering of what I see here. Now, these are recreations, and if you want to know about the drawing of this later, we can talk about it, but this is what I see a lot, right? Like, all right, I gotcha. Here's another one. It's super gloomy where my students live, right? We go here, get a lot of that, a lot of that. These are my philosophical students. They're really thinking about it here. And then, like, come on now. Good wait, right? Like the girl who cannot handle cats. 100-some students handing you these. And I'm like, okay, we've had a good time with this. But let me push this a bit. So then I'm going to ask them, what do you think about this if I tell you that this is the internet, and this is the internet, and this is the internet? Right? Yeah, exactly. So at this point, I'm getting a couple reactions. One, I've got my like just turned off, extra in the Walking Dead look. That's about 10%. They all look that way all the time. I don't take it personally. And then I've got some students who they start thinking about it, right? Like the eyebrows are sort of furrowed in, and they're like, okay, she's going somewhere, I'll follow her. And then I've got some that just like cognitive dissonance. Not gonna happen, grabbing their phones, cuddling them tight, like, no, the internet is in my back pocket, it follows me around everywhere I go. Whatever that was, not happening. And as fun as it is to sort of do this exercise, this is also the whole point. And so as much as I can sort of laugh off, millennials and their lives, the idea that for them the internet is the content on their screen, not the hardware of which it comes through, is something that I think we need to spend a lot more time on. The idea that the internet is an object, it's an abstraction, and it comes to us through ideas and labor and basically stuff. It is a thing, all right? And so that's where I kind of want to go. Now, don't get me wrong. I get the focus on content. I'm not saying, because you are all looking at me like, oh, okay. That's important. It's straight up, I'm never going to argue that. We are a network society. But the hardware is something that we've often left to mathematics, engineering, things like that. So what happens when social scientists get their hands on it? And that's what I want to start looking at today. So in my research, I really try to foreground the boring background elements of the internet. Like, how can I make this stuff super sexy again so we can all get into it and nerd out about it? And part of what I do with that is I really try to remember and to utilize Lisa Parks here. She's fabulous, read her, you'll love it. And the idea of the infrastructural imaginary. So when we go about thinking about communications and technology, how can we think of it in terms of an infrastructure? How are those where are those infrastructures located? Who controls them? What do they do? And by applying this to my research, I found that there is a lot of really interesting work being done, sort of on the backstage element, and things that we don't necessarily see, but are happening and really having a huge impact on how we experience the internet. So really thinking of the infrastructure of communications, that's where I want to go. I primarily work on mesh network development, but this can apply to satellites, mobile phones, you name it. Take it, use it, see what you can do with it. So mesh networks, I don't know if a lot of people are familiar with them. So really, what are they? Really quick. A mesh network is a network topology. It's a form of communications infrastructure where each node relays data for the network as a whole. All mesh nodes cooperate in the distribution of data in the network, allowing people and devices to seamlessly inter-network without the use of a pre-existing communications infrastructure. Mesh networks can operate as standalone infrastructure, or they can tap into the backbone of the commercially provided internet, providing access to a group of users by a single link. In terms of mesh networks, most people are familiar with sort of the free Wi-Fi that you get in the museum here, city centers, coffee shops, festivals. Those are mesh networks in terms of a typology and a philosophy, but they're often owned and controlled by large telecommunications corporations. They often have city influence and finance coming into it. And without being totally alarmist, if you have to click agree on a terms of service, you are in an entangled web of control and monitoring and all those super fun things that come along with that if you've ever read one of those terms of service. The mesh networks I work with are independent, they're community owned, and a lot of the groups that I'm looking at and that I work with are really looking at communications infrastructure from a social justice lens. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So for example, we've got community-owned and operated mesh networks that are challenging issues of ownership. So we've got Cheboksary Community Net, CCN. This is in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We've got New York's very own, okay. We've got NYC Mesh. They're super awesome. You're going to love them. So CCN is a registered Canadian charity and a volunteer organization that happens to be the first non-profit, publicly run telecommunications company in Atlantic Canada. And then NYC Mesh is working to create a free, resilient, standalone communication system. These have no central server, no single ISP, right? So when we think about ownership and in the hands of groups, like these community groups, we don't have to sort of stretch too far to think about what can happen with affordability, availability, speed, configuration, usage, data mining, when all of that is in the hands of the users and not in the hands of profit. Now, this is my jam right here. When we're looking at mesh networks and social change and activism. And some of the most fascinating work, I think, is being done in this space, because the real idea here is that the ability to organize and to mobilize, to create change, is really predicated on the ability to communicate without impediment from various groups. And that's where these two groups are really coming in. So the first ones that comes to mind is the Free Network Foundation. They were really active during the Occupy Wall Street movements. They put up freedom towers, is what they call them here, in the encampments. And from there, they were able to provide an alternative communications network to activists. Liam Young and his drones. Who doesn't love a drone, right? Like, I totally want one. I asked for Christmas, didn't get it. So from these drones, he's able to transmit Wi-Fi signals and create a network. And they can sort of, it's a pirate network, so it comes in, swarms an area, projects, and can disperse with like escaping detection and things of that. I think Liam Young sort of said it best in an interview to Time magazine. So I'm going to quote him verbatim here. At a large scale, you can imagine these systems crossing back and forth across national borders, occupying international airspace, so that it's more difficult for particular jurisdictions to legislate them. The more slippery and fluid the infrastructure is, the more difficult it is to close it down. So when we think of delivery, circulation, and that with communications in the hands of activists, there's a really real challenge being mounted against surveillance, protest policing, data mining, control. And a lot of the time we think of those sort of challenges in terms of software like Tor, but people are taking it straight to the hardware itself. It's really cool stuff. So the time I have today, there's my cats again. I can't introduce all the case studies I want to get into the methodology. I can do this, okay. All right, so really what I want to do is just get everyone to start thinking about how we can use an infrastructural imaginary, how we can start looking at the nuts and bolts of our technology, and how we can use that to truly push forward in our future and current sort of theoretical, methodological sort of trajectories when we're studying the internet as a thing. Yeah, okay, I made it within 12?
Yeah.
Someone drop a mic. And I'm not on the Twitter thing because I don't tweet, but feel free to email me.
Cool, thank you so much.
Thanks.
That was great. So our last but not least presenter is Anna Jobin. She is a PhD candidate with a multidisciplinary background in sociology, economics, and information management. Originally from Switzerland, she is currently at Cornell, researching interactions with algorithmic systems. Let's welcome Anna.
Okay, hello everyone, thanks for being here. Thanks also for these fantastic insights from my fellow panelists. I'm looking forward to the discussion. From my side, I thought I was going to talk about something completely different, but actually it comes together, it's very complementary to the talk you've just heard, because how does the internet get financed when, how do the cats get financed when it's not a mesh? We don't have time for this, so let me ask straight away, who of you has heard of Macedonian teenagers lately? Yeah, right. They have been all over the news because a few of them have become the media's poster children, and I think there's about how to make getting rich through internet advertising while posting fake news. And I won't be talking about Macedonia nor about teenagers, but I will be talking about internet advertising. I'll offer a glimpse into how the people actively involved in digital advertising make sense of their work and their ties based on an empirical study. Because digital advertisers, they translate between the technological specificities and traditional advertising approaches for clients, potential clients, and they sustain the very industry that sustains them. Okay, before focusing on digital advertising, let's address the elephant in the room, which is the fact that advertising is nothing new. Nor is it the fact to rely on advertising for as a business model. Just think of traditional media context, radio, TV, newspapers. And much like traditional media context, digital advertising is a key source of revenue for many contemporary corporations, although its place and role within particular markets may vary. And some things are new with digital advertising. There's, of course, the technology, but there are also changes that are concomitant with this new medium, such as easy access to abundance of new metrics, possibility of personalization, and these changes are also reflected in a somewhat modified industry structure that privileges vertical integration. Let's take, for instance, audience metrics, which have been a crucial commodity within the media industry because audience metrics inform media and advertisers about their potential public. And different kinds of methodologies and data coexist in what has become a well-populated and even somewhat regulated sub-industry. They're not only media outlets and advertisers, also audience metrics agencies, and even an institution auditing the rating agencies. And the purpose of audience metrics has always been to know as much as possible about the audience opinion, interests, and they have been conceptualized through survey evaluation, extrapolations, or inference. And the knowledge, or I would want to insist on the fact rather claims of knowledge about the audience's interests, they direct advertising and thus money in certain directions rather than others. That's why they're crucial. And with digital advertising, the whole advertising ecosystem has been impacted because there are not only new ways of advertising, there are also new ways of making claims about knowledge about the audience and its interests. So digital platforms such as Facebook and Google, they provide not only the medium within which the ads will appear, they are the same ones who also provide their own metrics about their audience and its interests, as well as their own dedicated algorithmic platform to create and manage the digital ads and to access the metrics. So there exist several kinds of digital advertising and some of them work differently, but I focus my attention on one particular type of Google ads, the search ads. So Google doesn't need an introduction anymore, but what needs to be said that it has been become Alphabet is now a market value of over $500 billion. And although today we can talk about self-driving cars and so on, it still generates most of its revenue through its initial business model, which consists of search ads, pairing advertising to search queries. But to do so, Google relies heavily on other people, on digital advertisers notably. So when thinking about online advertising, digital advertisers are often overlooked because the focus is mostly on platforms or on users. However, these advertisers, and be they marketing managers or account planners or whatever their job title, they perform crucial work for Google and for Facebook and the likes because they act as intermediaries between the digital platforms and the internet users and the advertising clients. And these advertisers must show a specialized understanding of the algorithmic platform, of the digital audience metrics, as well as the specific market logics. So in my research, I propose to consider online advertising as a result not only of data and of algorithms, but also of a set of activities and narratives by specific actors who must make sense of this new complex technological environment and new way of making knowledge claims. Therefore, in order to better understand online advertising, it is crucial to understand what participating stakeholders make of it. Which brings me to online advertisers. Again, it's just an overall term because no matter the name by which they go, for my purpose, they hold not only a very important position in their industry. I do find that they are also key actors for research because as experts, they are bound to have a discourse about what they do. And which is great when you interaction with algorithms because people like you and me, if I ask you why did you click the way you clicked or Google put in the words in Google the way you did, I don't know about you, I wouldn't be able to articulate it because it just happens the way it does and I could find justification afterwards. But digital advertisers, it's their job to know what they are doing and to be able to explain what they do and why they do. So in the time I have left, I would like to present some preliminary results of my ongoing research project that looks into algorithmic advertising. And the results are based on multiple hours of qualitative in-depth interviewing with digital advertisers in an ethnographic setting. And while there is so much to be said, I will focus on 3 particular points that seem interesting and interlinked. So the first one is how advertisers make sense of digital advertising in general and their role in the ecosystem in particular. And we're at the conference about theorizing, so let me just point out that the theory of sense-making, the sense-making approach by Carl Way, it provides great analytical tools to situate the individual discourse in organizational, temporal, as well as social settings. So digital advertising, the people I spoke to, they almost all seem to agree spontaneously. They said things like, well, digital advertising is inevitable anyway. So that was one of the words that I kept hearing. It's inevitable. It's there anyway, because how would the internet get financed? I like to propose this with your talk, right? Because it could be otherwise. Some even went as far as to laud their work of tweaking ads and ad campaigns as being beneficial for internet users, to say with a quote, since there has to be internet advertising, it might as well be relevant. And so, although they point out their unique position as experts of the advertising platform in question, they don't necessarily see themselves as active contributors to the overall advertising system, but merely as professionals who simply execute according to almost obvious rules created by Google and the very existence of the internet. So this almost ambiguous stance transpires also in the second point, which is their relation to Google. Because of the in-depth interviewing, it was easily possible to have answers that went beyond the official declarations. As the interview goes further and further, we started very formal and it became more informal after some time. And often at the beginning, no contact with Google was mentioned, but the longer discussion went on, the more eager they were to actually point out how well they get on with Google. Because the digital advertisers I talked to, they were certified by Google, and most of them have relatively frequent contact with Google's key account managers, people at Google who are available and help according to budget, number of clients, and so on. And so one advertiser would even say, depending on these parameters, Google will roll out the red carpet for advertisers. Well, of course, they make the money, you would say, but I like that analogy. And sometimes the privilege, however, it breaks down. For instance, when there's a new feature about how ads get displayed that was officially announced, but then one advertiser would say, "Well, why didn't my key account manager didn't tell me that before?" But then again, probably they didn't know either, and which shows that those key account managers, they don't have the advantage of actually knowing better. They're just inside the company. But yeah, and so, at the beginning, often people speak Google. What is Google when they speak about it? So that's another thing I was looking into. Google is often, at the beginning, it's the website and the algorithm or data or provider of algorithm data. The longer discussion goes on, the more and more Google is referred to as a company or as embodied in certain of its employees. And very rarely only, but that's why I like it even better, those different instances, algorithms and people, they get conflated as they do in this quote about Google. These people really exist. They're not at all black boxes, because I don't think anyone said people were black boxes. It's rather the whole thing. Algorithms are black boxes, but I should have illustrated that better, right? People as black boxes. Whatever. So, the third point is related to what I said before, which is that digital advertisers must not only be experts of the digital, but also of the traditional advertising. And it shows in the way, in their rhetoric, how they try to navigate different worlds, and they are in between. So they must adapt what they know about traditional advertising to the platform metrics and vice versa. They use concept of traditional advertising, so like they speak of the sales funnel and so on, but the same person who would use that example would later on say, well, actually, the concept of sales funnel, it doesn't even apply anymore because everything's different now with digital. And you have that at different point of the conversation, and I find it really telling the fact that they have to navigate in between, making sense of it on the one hand, and on the other hand, discrediting. So I find that a strong indication that they are between the two worlds and constantly having to translate between the two. Their clients benefit from their expertise, and in a certain way, Google benefits from their free advising and advertising for their advertising system. So to conclude, it can be said that digital advertisers navigate a complex socio-technical environment where they make sense of formal but also many informal norms conveyed by a technology largely outside of their control on the one hand, but they reenact themselves the belief in the way this technology works in activity and discourse on the other hand. So as intermediaries, these people are sustained by and simultaneously sustaining the way digital advertising works. Thank you.
What an outstanding group of theorists. We're going to open the floor for questions. Before we do, I want to make an interesting observation that we all talked about infrastructure, and in infrastructure studies, it's often assumed that infrastructure is invisible, right? It's cats, not the servers. And so I was wondering, to start off discussion, how is it that your work either reinforces this idea that infrastructure is invisible until it breaks down, or does your work challenge that idea? Anyone can start.
I guess I'll take it right off the top. Oh, do I need to use this?
Yeah, because of the
Okay.
last one.
My research is a direct response to that. So there's a lot of theorists in sort of the critical communications infrastructure world that say, we don't think about it until it's broken, right? Like if I turn the internet went off right now, like everyone would gasp, computers closed, like there's a thing, you get that it's there. No one right now is thinking about the pipes of water running under us. If it burst, we're thinking about it. And sort of that's one of the reasons why, at least in the field of communications, I think there's been a lot of work that sort of jumps over that and goes straight to the content and goes straight to the screen, because that's where the really cool stuff that we can see right now is happening. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens before it gets there. And what I want to do is sort of make that cool again and get that going and look at it before it's broken.
So the question of infrastructure is really interesting for me in particular because I am not a technologist. I'm an urbanist, and so a lot of what I've studied actually relates directly to infrastructure. And there's this kind of idea of infrastructure as sort of a phantasmagoria, right? Which is kind of speaking to the fact that you sort of take it for granted until it's broken. But also you sort of take for granted the sense in which infrastructure defines the essential elements of our culture and even our humanness in a way. And to make this to use the example of what you just mentioned about pipes breaking, it's really basic infrastructure, things that we kind of take for granted, are really modern phenomenon, right? They're basically only about 150 years old. And in fact, there's sort of different ways in which kind of quality of life are defined by access to those infrastructures, and that's very unevenly distributed. So it's really interesting to kind of consider that in light of these sort of high technologies or digital technologies as well.
Anyone else? Or we can open the floor for questions.
I found this talk is entitled, this conference, this part of the conference is entitled Ethics of Connection. And I found it interesting that none of the panelists actually mentioned the word ethics in their talk. And so I'm wondering if that might be somehow a reflection of the nature of the web, or does the web actually suggest some sort of ethics by its very nature?
Yeah, it's all you.
Yeah, I would like to ask the organizers of the conference why they put that title on our panel. Because I find it very interesting to find myself in it. But so there's the word. Then again, yes, it's not the word ethics. What I find really interesting, and what I probably had also in my proposal, is the words about social values. So what social values, what are the values that get embedded or not, and where do they come from? So do they come from, that's one of the questions I ask. Do they come from the advertisers? Do they come from, are they embedded in infrastructure, the way technology works? Or how does it work, and how do they circulate? Unfortunately, I don't yet have many answers to this, so I didn't feel ready to present it today, but that might be a hint to answer your question.
What she said.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really usually talk about my work in the context of ethics. I usually talk about it in terms of politics, and that is the language that I feel more comfortable in. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a lot to add to that.
Well, Anna, you just brought up a really great point, which is like the question of value and what we value and how that is interpolated into kind of the logic of the network. So partially in my talk, which is about these like locative games, right, like Pokemon Go and Ingress, like what they do is like they kind of, within the logic of the game, express what the developers of those games value, at least in an urban environment, right? So what gets to be a part of the node, what gets to be a node in that network, right? And in the case of those games, it's always like, you know, businesses. It's always these really normative landmarks, right? Like tourist destinations, right? Which in the case of, you know, a place like New York City, it's like you find that the kind of uneven and unequal geography of the city is completely reproduced in the network of the game, right? And that's really like kind of gets to this question of value and how certain values are expressed through networks.
So I kind of have a question maybe for all four panelists, kind of going off of the idea of ethics as values. I'm wondering about the ways in which, I guess, the popular image of the internet, for instance, with all of your students, how those certain popular images might suit certain people as opposed to other people within the larger interaction of us with the network. And then maybe if each of you sort of want to speak to how we begin to subvert that.
Say that last part again?
I'm very soft-spoken. Apologies. Oh, this is very short.
Is there?
Here we go.
This one's longer.
So basically, just to rephrase that question very quickly, how are the sort of popular images that we have of the internet or networks or public and private, how do some images suit or work better for some parties within these interactions than others?
Does anyone want to start that?
Sure, go.
Well, I mean, so in terms of like the thing I was talking about in terms of the public and the private, to me it seems like there is a certain way that discourses of privacy and the way that privacy is being talked about right now, even though often it's being talked about in a very critical way and, you know, talked about in the context of like we need more of it or we need to be protected from the state or from whatever, that it actually ends up serving to some extent like companies like Apple or companies that have done a really successful job at sort of like centralizing a lot of different functions that people use on the internet because it, you know, creates this sort of like generalized affect that we're just sort of like, you know, passively or without thought like distributing stuff all over, and that it's kind of like hopeless for us to imagine a sort of life on the internet that isn't sort of like locked down and proprietary. So, yeah.
There's something about the kind of topology of the network too, which is really interesting because it's always so, I mean, it's kind of popularly characterized as being very flat, right? It's like the network is this kind of flattening, equalizing mechanism in a way, right? Which I think can be both really great and has been used for great ends, but also can be really problematic because it tends to sort of brush over these, you know, sort of bumpy contours of that topology, like, for example, like who has more or less power within that network. So in a way, I think like that sort of idealized version of like a network as being pure horizontality in a way can serve ends that sometimes are like great, but also not so great depending on who's really employing that particular metaphor, I guess.
Yeah, and I would say I'd pick up on the same thing. So something that I try to do in talks, and maybe not as successfully today, is to keep like the idea of the internet in quotation marks, because we often talk about it as a singular thing, but the commercially produced internet available to you is networks upon networks upon networks upon networks, and they are diverse and they do different things. And there is, sort of when we talk about it in a singular way, we take all of that complexity out of it, and it becomes this simple, like, on-off transaction. I send you money, you send me the internet, like you're renting space. And it's more complicated than that. And there's a lot of innovation that's happening in that area. So I sort of mentioned about my background being in conflict analysis and resolution. I really started sort of in the space of activism, social media, and I started to get a little bit frustrated in that we were sort of talking about, like, can Facebook cause revolution? Now, this was a number of years ago, a lot of these debates are settled, but I remember thinking, like, Facebook isn't a thing, it's a platform, and it goes on and it goes off, but if you don't have access to the internet, then this conversation is mute. And I sort of pulled back a little bit and sort of see what else I could find when I dug things up, and that's where I started to look at networks. So one of the most popular examples that comes up is like, well, yeah, in Egypt they turned the internet off. Well, no, they didn't. They turned a part of it off, the part that they were renting to people to access. The internet didn't go down. And so when you start thinking of the various layers of the network, people were still on it. And there's a great group, Telecomics, who were able to use old radios to tap into the parts that still existed. And so there's lots of challenge that's happening in that space that we often don't see because we don't know that we should be looking. And then once we're all totally looking for it, you'll see it everywhere. So I guess that's what I would sort of answer to that.
Do we need to talk about whom advertising is serving and how it might recreate inequality because of defining people as consumers, their work as consumers? I think that, I mean, I could go on and on, but maybe during the break or later on.
Another question? Yes.
Question is maybe specifically for Benjamin, but thinking about we were talking about queer temporality, and I wonder, and as kind of a perpetuation of youth, of image, this like permanent immaturity, and I was wondering if you could kind of clarify for me a little bit, like how Snapchat, what Snapchat's doing there. Is Snapchat capturing that, defanging it, kind of depoliticizing it, or is Snapchat kind of is Snapchat you know, a radical form of social media, you know, for this, you know, for kind of participating in this, you know, or capitalizing on this queer temporality in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about it mostly as monetization of those ideas or whatever. And of course, I don't think that it's a sort of, you know, I don't think that people who are working at Snapchat are probably reading queer theory. But I think that there is a way that it kind of makes sense that the new ways that you can profit off of people on the internet would sort of resonate with some of the ideas that, you know, queer theory have been talking about, queer theorists have been talking about for a long time. I don't see Snapchat as being a radical institution or even a queer thing, but I do think that they sort of provide a important space to have a particular kind of intimacy that I think that a lot of people are lacking, because a lot of the different ways that we used to experience intimacy have been like put into these contexts like Facebook, you know, that are not particularly intimate for people, right? So I think it provides a sort of useful service to allow people to, you know, have a safer space to like experiment, like in terms of their sexuality, and you know, it's doing interesting things. But you know, the point that I made in the beginning of my talk, where I was talking about how it's an increasingly marginal part of Snapchat, I think is really important, because the reason why it's an increasingly marginal part of Snapchat is because it's the hardest to monetize, right? And it, to me, speaks to the sort of problem of not only are we sort of replacing like, you know, things that maybe used to happen in public with a sort of privatized version, but we're trading that for a privatized version of that that's also highly centralized and highly leveraged, right? So that Snapchat doesn't have a lot of, there's not a lot of incentive for them to maintain that, part of their infrastructure, especially because it like makes them, sort of complicit as like pornography distributors, right? So, all that to say, like, I think that probably for me, like, one of the key issues of like thinking about, creating spaces for like queer sociality, or like thinking about not just a sort of like capital ingestion of queerness, but actually like a proliferation, is decentralization, which I think we're seeing actually just the opposite of.
Hi, I'm curious, I know you all have some issue with the idea of ethics and that vocabulary, but I am curious about that decentralization and how it could interact with ethics in a kind of negative way. I've been working recently on advertising and child exploitation on YouTube, and when you talk to YouTube, when you talk to advertisers, when you talk to content creators, they all say, it's not our responsibility. They kind of blame this decentralized platform, even their own platform, like even YouTube. They say 400 hours of content are uploaded every minute. How are we supposed to keep track of what's happening there? Like, how are we supposed to regulate this? We can't control the thing that we've created. It's decentralized. So I'm curious how those kind of dynamics of centralization and decentralization feed into the idea of how people on the internet and internet providers and controllers kind of think about ethics.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, the problem with YouTube is that it's not decentralized, right? It's like Google. It's a centralized company that is making its own sort of decisions about how to regulate things like that, that are, again, based upon this massive valuation that they have, right? And to me, like, they could talk about the decentralization of YouTube in the way that, like, it's user-generated, free for them, for Google content, but it's not decentralized as a, in terms of the platform. And that's, like, to me, like, what would be much more interesting in terms of, like, I think producing, like, more ethical, I guess, ways of engagement online, right? It's not that, we need platforms where, like, anybody can do anything, but we need a lot of different kinds of things. We need a world in which, like, it's not just like Facebook and Google and Snapchat like ingesting all things from the internet, and people feeling that, like, in order to be connected to their friends, they have to go to these 3 places or whatever, these 3 or 5 or 6 sites owned by a couple of companies. To me, it's like the I think you'd start to see, like, more interesting ways of dealing with problems, and also see, like, more interesting ways of, like, having connection in general if you didn't have it all controlled by, like, 4 different companies.
No, I mean, I agree completely what you said about YouTube not being effectively centralized. I'm thinking because if you've heard of Mastodon. Okay, so that's this supposedly a decentralized social network coming out, and I'm only just reading up about what it is being said and not, but that would be a great question. So what would that change? In what way might it be ethical or not to use it? So I do of course agree with my fellow panelists that it's not only about values, it's also about power. So who has the power to enforce their values or not, or gets heard or not. So when decentralized, what we mean also remove one instance, one main mode of power, and so distribute the power among them. So about Mastodon, what is also you connect yourself, well, like a mesh network, but you do social network, mesh network as a service. as a social service. But what could happen is, there's no central control anymore. So you could not necessarily know what will happen with your data, and you will have no one to point to at. Of course, you put those on a balance. I mean, I know which side I'd probably be on personally, but that would be one of the points we could discuss. As long as there is a company behind a service they provide, you could theoretically have legal institution in place, and you put accountability or not on those institutions. When it's entirely distributed, it would be much more difficult when something goes wrong. But then again, I mean, we have to figure out those things in a way.
Go for it if you want.
I keep thinking, because I'm writing about like queer, blah blah blah. I keep thinking about like gay bars, and like gay bars are private spaces that are trying to make a profit, but there's a lot of them, especially in New York, and like if one of the gay bars starts to like sell your data, or charges a lot more for drinks, or does something problematic, you can go to another gay bar. But like you can't really, I mean, you can do that with Facebook, but like there's something about the way that I think we feel uncomfortable being on like networks that there's not a lot of people or whatever. Like there's like this way that Facebook doesn't really have a lot to fear, I don't think, in terms of like people going to the other social network or whatever. They're just entrenched, and so it'd be like if all the gay bars like combined into one gigantic gay bar. Sorry.
I really want to make it. Go for it.
Well, it might if new legislation will ask everybody to hand in their Facebook password. I do think that would have an impact about how many people will use Facebook. So especially people who are international visitors like myself, and we need to cross borders. So I am actively thinking of how much longer will I be able to use Facebook the way it is. Then again, that's if you have one point of attack. That's the whole point. There's one point of accountability, or one point not, and it goes with good aspects, but also less handy aspects depending on the social values that are enforced by other institutions. So.
Anyone else want to respond?
I think I'm okay. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
It was interesting for me to see both in Joshua's talk and in Anna's talk the idea that monetization basically informs the intent and the vision of a lot of different products. So like Ingress and Pokemon Go being financed by this specific entity, and advertising being the inevitable in how people monetize their content. I guess my question for everyone is, how do you find the changing of the channeling of finance can change the politics and the intent of the products that you talked about?
Are you okay if I just
go for it?
Finance is a big one in terms of mesh networks and infrastructure, because you have to buy the nuts, you have to buy the bolts. You've got to, like in New York here, NYC Mesh is a challenge because they have to rent space on roofs to set up supernodes. And one of the reasons why I have chosen specifically to study independent, non-commercial mesh networks is because of all the traps and entanglements that come with financing. So, for example, if you're looking at city Wi-Fi, often there is things in there that you agree to in terms of data mining, geolocation, all that stuff is imposed on the network you're using, and they pull that. A lot of the groups that I'm looking at and that I'm working with really want to strip all of those entanglements out. This is communication in sort of its clearest form. They really just want people to be able to push their information around and not be worried that what they sort of say is going to pop up on them in another way, or that their usage is going to be metered and monitored, and then they're going to get hit with overages charges and whatever that really means, overage what, or they're going to get throttled. Specifically in terms of like the activist networks, this is a big one when you're thinking about protest policing and communication mining and kettling that happens because there's an awesome algorithm that has just figured out on Twitter exactly where your protest is going, and they're there before you. And so these sort of groups that I'm looking at want to strip all of that out. There's like CCN is a non-profit, strictly non-profit. And depending on how you want to sort of participate, there are memberships that allow you voting rights because it is a community board and everything goes to a vote. And so in that sense, there's sort of this idea in some of these groups that every time you take funding, you take the entanglements that come with it. And so they're working very hard at making sure that those streams align with what it is they want to do.
So I was told we need to keep a very strict time, and we're unfortunately out of time. So let's give our panelists a round of applause for serializing the web. And I'm sure they'll be around to answer more questions.